Everyone, summer is here, the sun, the heat. We are recording this episode from Paris to Los Angeles, where in Paris it's almost 101 degrees Fahrenheit right now, properly hot. By the way, we just launched our Instagram, Visionary Minds podcast. It took us 2 years to finally do it, but here we are. Starting September, we will be sharing conversation, moment, and highlights from the show over there. So go follow us. Visionary Mind is produced by Disset Paris. We are an agency born in Paris 10 years ago, now also in New York City. 2 cities and one obsession, the people who are shaping the future of luxury, one conversation at a time. And we really wanted to almost end this season on something that matters. The luxury industry is at the turning point, not a bad quarter, not a temporary slowdown, a structural weakening. And most brands are still waiting for things to go back to the way they were. And they won't. My guest today doesn't soften that. He says it clearly. He says it to the people who need to hear it most. And he backs it up with data, with decades of research, and with the kind of direct language that is very rare in an industry that tends to dress everything up. Professor Dr. Daniel Langer is the CEO of Équité, one of the world's leading luxury strategy firms. Is executive professor of luxury strategy at Pepperdine University and at NYU. The Economist calls him the authority in luxury. Robb Report says he stands at the forefront of luxury innovation. He has advised Ferrari, LVMH, Porsche, Raffles, Richemont. He speaks 7 languages and he has lived on 4 continents. He has spent 30 years in rooms where the real decision about the world's most iconic brands get made. He just published a 40-page strategic report on where luxury is going from now to 2030. The title is The Cost of Waiting. It's not a comfortable read, but it's a necessary one. So Daniel, welcome to Visionary Mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a great honor and great pleasure to be on your podcast.
So Daniel, before we get into the report, I want to understand who you are, because the resume is impressive. But what I'm more interested in is the trajectory. Europe, Asia, Africa, the United States right now, Nestle, L'Oreal, then a pivot into luxury strategy. There is a thread in there. Where do you come from? And how did you end up doing this for a living?
Yeah. It's actually really a fascinating question because, if you had asked me maybe 20, 25 years ago, where I would end up, where I would live, how my life would be, how my career would be, I would not have guessed almost any of what happened. But if I look back retrospectively, in a sense, everything makes sense. So everything started with a very deep appreciation for brands. I had this all my life. In my family, there were, many of my family members were working in marketing and sales. My father was a marketer in the automotive industry. And so I got early in my life inspired really by brands and always had the dream to, manage brands myself. And so I studied marketing, business administration, as I said, focus on marketing. But also I always felt that when you do marketing, you have to balance that. So I balanced this with finance, with econometrics. So I went hardcore into numbers and mathematics. But at the same time, also in terms of, really fundamental understanding of businesses. And I started my university trajectory in Germany, and the German system still has the philosophy of the original university or universitas philosophy, that you should not only learn what you're interested in, but you should also be challenged by something that is a little bit outside of that field. So I had to choose one thing that was outside of business. And so I chose psychology. And little should I know at that time that all of this in the end was connected. Then was very fortunate because I did an internship in my very first year at the university at Nestle. And the person I was reporting to saw maybe more of a talent in myself than I saw at that time. And at the end of the internship, he put a contract on my table and said, this contract you have to sign, it's non-negotiable, and you're going to start as a full-time employee afterwards. I became the first person within Nestle who was still a full-time student and became a full-time employee. And I was working in the coffee department, and at that time we were developing the Nespresso brand, and that was for me a very fascinating time, because it really taught me to think about a brand in a really very deeply strategic fashion, and not just in terms of traditionally we develop a brand concept or so, but we also had to think about the business model, about fundamental differentiation, because coffee is a business where you have a natural product, and it's the bean, and fundamentally player A, B, C, D, E does the same thing. So if you're the next one that comes to the market and you do the same thing than anyone else, yes, you can kind of buy yourself into the market through awareness, through a lot of spending, but you don't really get a competitive advantage. So in development of that business, we had to think really completely out of the box, rethink the entire business model, rethink the economics of it. And that deeply shaped me. And afterwards, I moved. When I graduated, I decided to leave the food industry, because I wanted to experience a different category, but also I wanted something that is much faster and more competitive. And I felt that beauty is the right place. And so I started at L'Oreal, and L'Oreal to me is still today probably one of the best marketing schools in the world. Incredibly intense. I would say intensity is really how I would define the time. And also here I was put in the beginning in a bit of an uncomfortable situation. At least I thought so, and because I wanted to really work on brands, and then I was told you can only work on brands if you qualify for it, and you have to go to sales first. And as someone who was thinking to be a hardcore marketeer, for me, this was almost like thinking about the military service or so. I said, oh shit, I have to now spend a couple of months or so or a year in a sales role. Little should I know that that totally defined my life and my entire career. And I got really thrown into the cold water. I remember my first day in the office. I got a big suitcase full of samples. Then basically I spent one day with each member of the marketing team to get introduction into product categories that I had zero familiarity with, like lipsticks, makeup, and so on. So after one full day, I get a list of my clients, and then my boss said, okay, you're going to relocate to the south of Germany, you're taking over Bavaria and Munich, and you have to double the business, and if you don't double the business, you're fired. That was the brief.
Okay.
And then he said, also, it's very easy because your predecessor was not very good, so we fired him a few months ago, so there's only upsides. So then I packed my bag, drive to Munich, find a place there, visit my first customer, and then every single customer that I come to says, you're the new guy. Fantastic. Let me show you all the shit that your predecessor has been doing. And before you clean up the whole thing, you're not allowed to even sell anything. So I really started in that trajectory in a completely different way than I thought, and based maybe in the most difficult starting position that could ever have been. But you have to survive. And I remembered my boss who said, you don't double the business, you're out. So I was able to not only double the business, but almost make the business 3 or 4 times bigger in just 6 to 7 months. And what I learned was really that is all about the relationships with the clients, because I had to rebuild trust. I had to rebuild the relationship in almost no time, and then basically switch from cleaning up to performing. And that basically taught me, that actually you can make a huge difference as a human in a business. And then when I moved back into the marketing role in the headquarter, then I learned also one thing that also stayed with me my entire life. And I would say this is really the strength of the L'Oréal philosophy. And this is that there is never a difficult market in a sense. You always have to find a way to grow. There is no excuse. You cannot just say, the market is negative and therefore we are negative. Anyone with that mindset would be out in no time. So in order to survive, you had to basically create a kind of non-nonsense, super brutal growth mindset and just find ways to grow brands. And I would say these two experiences at Nestle, shaping completely and defining new business models, and at L'Oréal, learning in an absolute non-nonsense way how to grow a brand no matter what, and no matter how difficult it is and no matter how the market is, that completely shaped my way of thinking. And then I stayed in the beauty industry for another 17 years. Worked for Henkel, for the German competitor of L'Oréal. And this was also a fascinating phase, and that basically goes also a little bit back to your question about having lived in so many places and so on. And I should maybe say that my having a Portuguese mother and a German father taught me early also about living in kind of different cultural environments. Then I grew up in Nigeria because my father was working there for a few years. So my very early childhood memories were already also kind of, not necessarily European, but very African in a way. And then at Henkel, I was working always in international management and marketing. Started as a brand manager, became relatively fast a senior brand manager. Was able basically to grow every brand I touched grew. The first brand that I was managing had a revenue of about 20 million euros for 60 years. Never grew. I took it over in 2 years. It was 100 million. And everything basically changed in that brand. And then then basically that qualified me to take over one of the more strategic brands of the company. Also managed to make a very quick turnaround. And I started to see a pattern. And the pattern was that the brands that are not growing are typically neglected in a very specific way. And it's a very interesting way because it's something that is hidden in plain sight, and most brand managers never understand, most agencies never understand, most companies never understand. And it is basically a lack of a fundamental brand story. The brands that this brand that I took over, 60 years non-growth, they had a brand positioning that was relevant 60 years ago, but then competitors came in, and then the brand basically from being different than any other brand suddenly started to become the same as everything else. And so it lost basically its uniqueness. And so my very first thing was to go back and to try to understand what made this brand successful in the very beginning. Why was this brand at some point going from 0 to 20? And then what was the moment when the brand started to stall and then stay just constant over time? And so that was really, these were really very, very important insights that I gained. And they basically qualified me then to take over the Japanese business for the company and restructure the Japanese business, bring that business back from being, negative for many, many years into a growth trajectory. Then I was brought back into the headquarters to run the global hair business. So I had a global role working in managing brands over, I think, about 40 or 50 countries. Then a P&L responsibility that was close to $1 billion. Then was appointed to be responsible for the German business, and then afterwards took over North America. And so in my career with brands, I had the opportunity really to work around the world, to work with, really fascinating brands in completely different cultures. And every single time, what I found is that brands that are not growing lack the fundamentals. And interestingly, anyone who managed the brand before never really understood that. And therefore, basically, I became, I would say, quite known in the organization as a bit of a fixer for brands. And at some point, I had to manage a business where, and this was back in Japan, where I didn't only have to bring brands back to health, but also make sure that these brands are not only healthy from a market share perspective, but also from a profitability perspective. And profitability was so bad in that business that in the end I had to improve the profitability, I think, by 2x, 3x, or 4x. And the main lever to do so was increasing prices quite significantly. So now the question is, how do you do that? How do you increase a price on a brand that has been in the market for 20 years? Let's say has always been, let's make our life easy. The brand has always been $10, and now you have to increase it to 30. So 3x. And then I thought there's not really a lot of business school cases for that. You find cases for 10%, for 20%, but not for 3x. So then I thought, okay, let's make my life easy. Let me speak with the luxury industry. And I had a couple of contacts with a couple of luxury CEOs that I knew, spoke with them. Turns out they never had to solve such a problem because they were running basically historic houses that were there for 100 years, 150 years, 200 years or so. And they basically over time established a very specific price point, but they never had the challenge to reposition the brand and make it dramatically more valuable. And then I thought, okay, interesting. The practitioners can't help me. So maybe the professors can help me. And, through my own business school, I had the opportunity to speak with a couple of the marketing professors that were teaching at that time. And then I made another interesting observation. And this was that a lot of them never really worked in companies. So they had quite interesting research, but the research was pretty much disconnected from what I needed in running a brand myself. And so I went back to my business school and decided to make a doctoral thesis on luxury. And little did I know, and maybe it was good that I didn't know, because otherwise I would never have done it. Little did I know that there was practically very, very little research even on what creates value. How does a brand, what are the drivers of value? What are the drivers of desire? Why are people drawn into very specific brand? The research was practically zero. We looked back into every single research paper the last 10 or 15 years prior, and there was not one research paper that was relevant on the luxury industry, on the fundamentals. So that basically really shaped me. I did my doctoral thesis. I called it Decoding Luxury. And in a sense, the rest is history. Then, business schools invited me to teach. And so what started a bit as a hobby became more and more serious, started to write books about luxury. And then I got more and more consulting requests from the industry. And then about 10 years ago, I had to basically make a decision whether I wanted to stay in corporate and take over a different role, or whether I use that opportunity to exit corporate and start my own company. And then I thought, if I don't do it today, I will probably never do it in my life. And then I took a big leap of faith and started Équité. And I have to say it was the best decision of my life. And then Ferrari became one of our very first clients. And I had the opportunity to work at that time with Sergio Macchione, who was leading the company and who wanted to kind of think how to future-proof the brand. And it was fascinating because I was writing an article in The Economist at that time about the future of luxury, which he read. And he then said, everything I wrote kept him up at night. And that gets back to, when you made the introduction and you said that, I'm very candid in what I say. This has always been my conviction. I don't like to sugarcoat things. I don't like to hedge. I like to point at things as they are, because I'm convinced if we hedge, if we basically if we are not really addressing the things that need to be addressed, then in the end we end up not doing the right decisions. And that's basically has been my philosophy ever since. So in the meantime, we have been working with probably most of the I would say all of the large luxury houses in some fashion. We work in practically all product categories, from private aviation to hospitality to high jewelry, fine jewelry, watches, fashion, automotive, you name it. Practically, I don't think that there was almost any category I've not been working on the last 10 years. And one of the learnings to me, and then I will pause for a moment, but one of the learnings for me was the category matter much less than most people believe. I still find so many people who believe that, you have to be an expert in fine spirits to, run a fine spirits brand, or you have to be an automotive expert to run an automotive brand, or you have to be a fashion expert to run a fashion brand. And I would say today it's all crap. I'm advising so many boards and so many people, and across the industry, every single brand has the same issues. And the issues are never category specific. The issues are always, is our story differentiated? Is our experience different, and so on? And the answer in most cases is no. And that's typically the root cause. And then, of course, you need to have certain category specifics. If you build a private plane, then of course you should know a little bit about building planes. If you do let's say a whiskey, you should know a lot about whiskey. But in the end of the day, it is a consumer. And if I take myself also as a consumer, I'm now in a meeting with you, and then, early in the morning, I was at my gym, so I was a consumer at the gym. And maybe tonight I'm going to go to a restaurant, so I'm going to be a consumer at the restaurant. And maybe during the day I'm going to buy a couple of things, so I'm going to be a consumer of certain brands. I don't change as the customer. So and the expectations that I have in one experience now shape the expectation in another experience. And a lot of companies forget that, and they think a lot about their product, but they often, and I would even go as far and say most companies neglect the client. They over focus on themselves. So they're very internally focused, and they don't have a lot of client focus. As an organization, of course, there's always people in companies that will focus on the client, but as an organization, most companies are not client-centric enough, and this is the root cause for a lot of issues.
And more recently, you spent months building this 40-page strategic report that I was telling in the intro. It's a report on where luxury is going from now to 2030, and like I said, the title is The Cost of Waiting. My question is, why did you sit down and write this report, and also why now? What was important for you to say?
So it is, I'm always, as I said, I like to be brutally honest, and I'm also like to be brutally honest with myself. And in the beginning of the year, I was asked, and it's the question maybe that I get most often, by clients, but also when I'm on stage and do presentations. I was asked where I believe the market is going, and my answer at that time was, we had a very weak 2024 in the luxury industry. So 2024 was a bit of a turning point year. After the pandemic, 21, 22, 23 were growth years. And then 23 already was a decreasing growth rate, but still positive. And 2024 was negative. And 2024 was the first time that the market turned negative in a non-crisis year. So there was no geopolitical crisis other than the ones that had already been existing, but there was no shock. There was no economic crisis, and the market turned negative. And the market turned negative because of many luxury brands not doing their job right. So it is not basically, the consumers now getting fatigued overall with luxury. No, it's just consumers started to fundamentally distrust luxury brands. So we started to get a trust issue. And the trust issue was informed by a lot of brands who increased prices during the pandemic in an unprecedented fashion. And those price increases then translated into basically a lack of value perception. And so prices went up, value didn't go up. So the spread between prices and value got bigger and bigger. And then people say, okay, at this point, I don't buy anymore. I don't purchase. That happened in 2024. And interestingly, not so much changed. The industry did more of the same. Some brands started to do some changes, but most of them actually doubled down a little bit. Price increases got a little bit less, but you didn't see significant change. So I was not super surprised that 2025 also was negative, slightly negative. I think it was a minus 1%, and or 1.5% roughly. So, and then my expectation for 2026 was, after 2 years of decline, you kind of reach a baseline. Customers kind of get used to those higher price points because a lot of brands have not fixed their fundamentals. The market probably is not going to grow dramatically, but I thought that we probably would have gotten to a plateau, that we would basically be more or less flat in 2025. And then also with the pressure of declining growth rates or so, companies would start to finally do more work on the value end of the equation, and then basically turn this into a slight growth as of 2027. So that was my going in assumption. So a flat 2020, flat to maybe slightly positive +1, +2, 2026, and then a growth trajectory afterwards. And then came the conflict in Iran, in the Middle East. And basically, I've thought also here, I looked into, what analysts were saying, what brands were assuming. Of course, I got a lot of calls from brands, what do we do now? How do we react to that? How is the sentiment developing, and so on. So first I saw that there was a lot of uncertainty in the market, and there was a lot of needs for brands to get maybe more advice and more guidance. But the second was that I felt that almost no one is modeling the effects that are not the direct effect, but the second and third order effects. And I give you a very simple example. I do a lot of keynote presentations. I'm at get a lot of invitations to speak at events, and I had 2 presentations that were supposed to be in, I think, like in around mid-April. So when the conflict basically was starting to really escalate, and both presentations were cancelled. And the presentations were cancelled practically for the same reason, or for kind of connected reasons. In one presentation was cancelled because a lot of the participants were from the Middle East, and the event organizer then decided to postpone that meeting to a later stage, so that the participants from the Middle East would be able to participate. And another presentation was basically cancelled because they felt that it's not appropriate, while some of their team in the Middle East were under immense distress in being in Dubai and being in Qatar and then some of the other places, than to do an event. And then I kind of started to calculate and say, okay, if I just take these two events that I can observe, there were hotel bookings, there were flight bookings, and all of these. So these are then the second order effects. And then, you travel to another place and then people would go to restaurants. That starts to become the third order effects. So each of these things start to trickle down, and then you have the oil price that increases. And I always like to look at the full system, including, the geopolitics, when you have increasing gas and oil prices, this has effects on consumer sentiment, and so on. So we started to model a little bit and said, okay, let's basically not just look at one or two events, but let's basically take a step back and basically say, okay, what does elevated oil prices, what effect does it have on airline tickets? And then what effects may this have on the travel industry, and so on. And then we started to see really fascinating things in our modeling. And then at some point I said, okay, what will be the outcome of this? And when we actually started to do that modeling, and I think this was early or mid-April, early May, my estimate for this year was actually even more negative than it is right now. But still, for this year now, I expect a quite significant decline of the market, somewhere between -2% and -4% overall. And then I also believe that in 2027, because the second order effect and the third order effect, even if the conflict at the moment looks like it's easing a little bit and hopefully will be resolved in the next couple of weeks and months. And then with a little bit of luck, also the Middle Eastern region will come back. But let's maybe look at the Middle Eastern region for a moment. If you look at the let's call it the business model of Dubai, and also the business model that Saudi Arabia was building, with the NEOM project, with the Vision 2030, Riyadh, and so on. Look at Qatar, look at some of the other places, Abu Dhabi. And I spent quite a lot of time in that region also. So I've been in the last 18 months, probably 10 times or so in the regions for different projects. And this region is built on the story of stability. Everything is a story. It's a story of stability, it's a story of prosperity, and it's a story of the future is better than today. So of course, what happened now in the last couple of months fundamentally shook the foundations of that story. And I'm the last one that is going to say, the Dubai story is over, the Abu Dhabi story is over. They will come back. It's a very resilient culture. Also, they're going to come back and for sure rebuild a lot of the trust. But rebuilding trust, rebuilding a story takes time. It's not going to come back tomorrow. The tourists are not going to be back tomorrow in the same fashion as they have been before. So all of this basically takes time. So when we started to model that, we looked into, what are our basically best case, worst case hypothesis on, how the industry is going to come back in different areas. How is one area affecting the other? Because if one region is kind of, declining, then are the other regions growing because of that, or is basically this a demand that is going away? So basically, this kind of reckoning in around April, May, that we have through this geopolitical shock right now a fundamentally different situation than we just had 4 or 5 months ago, was actually the starting point. But you mentioned this also in the intro. Of course, it's not only geopolitics. That would be too easy. The industry, as we discussed already a little bit, has been already quite challenged over the last couple of years. We spoke already about the trust issue, the lower perceived value of many brands. But then there's another fundamental shift that a lot of companies are not, I don't want to say not taking, probably I should say it, they're not taking it serious enough, or they're not basically prepared enough. And this is the shift to Generation Z. I still have so many conversations where people tell me, oh, they're not yet our clients. And I say, guys, if they're not yet our clients, maybe they will never be your clients, because right now they should already be your clients. And so you have a generational shift. This generational shift has different expectations. Expectations overall are shifting. Competitive situation is shifting all around the world. China is moving from an easy growth country, that so many brands were used to for two decades, where almost automatic growth came through distribution expansion, wealth expansion, and so on. China is now a mature country. China, basically, the market is still growing, the luxury market, but it's growing at a much, much slower pace as it was before. Before we had every year double-digit growth. Now we have maybe 3%, 2%, 1%, 4% growth. And it's not going to go back to 20%. And then also Chinese consumers are changing. They are not necessarily now seeing the Western brands as the pinnacle of achievement, but in a lot of categories, they're starting to see their own brands as the pinnacle. Just look at automotive. And so it's really a fascinating time at the moment. And this is also why I called the report The Cost of Waiting. It's a fascinating time because everything changed at once. And the change was visible. I've been warning the industry for the last 4 or 5 years that they have to change, they have to adapt. And many companies thought they have time. Many companies thought, we don't have to do it now. We can do it in a few years, the customers, everything, we have time. And, the fatal mistake is everything that we are discussing now, has been visible for 5, 6, 7 years, minus the geopolitical shocks. But that a shock comes is normal. Every couple of years, a shock comes. Whether there's a financial crisis, whether there's this or that, there's always something that will disrupt the market. And if you are in a weak starting position at times of a shock, and hallelujah, then basically the companies talk to themselves why they are not in the best position.
Yeah, you're also right that 70 to 80% of luxury growth between 2023 and 2025 came purely from price increases, not from new products, not from new desire, just from charging more. But back in these days, margin went up, shareholders were very happy, and boards approved. Isn't that just rational management?
No. It is rational on a short, I should say yes and no, but I want to be very precise. I told you that when I was a student, I started to also become very fascinated with finance, with mathematics, econometrics, and so on, and also studied game theory. And I'm obsessed with game theory. And game theory is something that I would recommend every manager to use all the time. And, I'm teaching not only students, but I'm also teaching at Pepperdine, for example. I have a program where I'm a professor that is called President and Key Executive Program. So there we teach company presidents, company CEOs, very, very senior leaders. It's also fascinating because I love my MBA students and my MBA programs. But when you teach at that level, you actually really see what the people who are in charge, how they think. And it's fascinating that there's not a lot of the people that I have in my class that even sometimes a lot of them never heard about game theory. A lot of them never used or applied game theory in their thinking. And when you basically apply game theory, you have to think about business as a multi-period game. Most managers think about a single period or a kind of short period games. They think about the next quarter, they think about the next the next 6 months. They think about the next year. And I would even add, and for me, it's interesting. As you said, I live now in the US, but I lived in Europe, I lived in Africa, I lived in Asia. And when I moved to the US, I saw different to Europe, a management philosophy where a lot of managers basically as a default think they're going to be in the company for 2 or 3 years and then they will move on. So they don't see a company as a destination. They see a company as a building block for their career. And then they act often this way. So if you basically go to a company and say, I'm being here for 2 or 3 years, I have to get the best results out of 2 or 3 years. And what happened afterwards, I couldn't care less. I'm just going to squeeze the heck out of everything that I'm doing. Then you get to a lot of the things that we are observing. And of course, also, in Europe, this also gets adapted more and more. And in a culture where companies have to report every quarter and have to perform every quarter, there's always let's call it the rational move to deliver on every quarter. The problem is if you play a 1 or 2 period game, you will always lose the multi-period game. It's pure game theory. In game theory, the player that wins is the player that has the longest time horizon and prepares for the worst case. That's always the player that wins. In any game theoretical modeling, you will never be able to win against the long-term player that basically prepares for the worst. The player who always loses is the short-term player who just optimizes for the next period. So your question whether this is rational, for the short-term player it's rational. For the long-term player, it's also rational, but the strategies are completely different. If I manage a brand long-term, I will do different decisions than if I manage the brand for the next quarter. And it's interesting when you look at who is right now, when you think about the fashion industry, fashion, leather goods, and so on. I would say that the company that had consistently the best results, the highest returns, the best business performance has been Hermes. And Hermes is playing a long-term game. They are not playing a short-term game about optimizing the next quarter, optimizing the next month or so. I'm pretty sure they do that too. And they look into the immediate results, but they don't compromise the long-term for the short-term. And then you have other brands that are short-term players that basically just optimize for the next month. And I would say especially the fashion industry is very, very vulnerable to that, because the fashion industry, is working on very short fashion cycles. That's also why you call the industry fashion. They are very short cycles, but also, what is the typical fix in fashion? So you have a brand, the brand is not working, you fire the creative director, you hire the next creative director. So next creative director comes in, is under a lot of pressure, because they have to perform. Everyone will look at their collections immediately, whether the collection is great or so. There's super big scrutiny. So, I would not want to be in that position at all. But it also forces now a new person to make something visible. And let me take a brand, for example, where if you look at historical patterns, you can see this is basically the prototype brand of that, and that's Burberry. Burberry is, I don't know, probably for the last 20 years, 25 years, is in permanent restructuring. Burberry, basically every 2 or 3 years, there's a new CEO. Every time the new CEO comes in, what are they announcing? They say, we are going to make the turnaround, everything is going to be better, and blah, blah, blah. And then you see sometimes numbers improving for a quarter or 2 or 3, and then everything falls apart. Then the CEO goes, the creative director goes, the next one comes in. And then look what Burberry did over the last 20 years. Practically every new creative director changed the logo. And then every new creative director changed slightly the way how everything looks. No one so far worked on the fundamentals. No one told us as a consumer, what is basically Burberry even standing for? Why, why should I, spending my time here in the US between two beautiful places, Los Angeles and Scottsdale, Arizona? Why should I basically buy anything from Burberry? What do they give me emotionally? They only tell me they're from London, they're English, they're British. Great, fantastic. But is not relevant for me living here in the US, whether the brand is British or not. I want to know, what do I get emotionally? And this is the problem that not only Burberry has, but so many brands have, is they can explain to me what product they're making, but they cannot explain to me how they will make me feel different, how they are basically impacting my emotional state. What is the fundamental reason why I should buy it? And now this becomes interesting because, I told you that there was very little research on what really drives value in luxury. And still today, there is not a lot. And I've been obsessing over the last 20 years really with showing quantitatively what drives value. And I can tell you the number one driver of value is the storytelling. There's nothing that drives so much value as the story. And the story can be, if you want to have a multiplier, it can be 100x value multiplier. It can be 1,000x value multiplier. That's the story. Story is so fundamental. And most companies have no story that is differentiated. Most companies say, we are brand X, we were born in 1750, and we are in this category, and we have the best craftsmanship and the best quality, and that's it. And practically 80-90% of brands, maybe even more, have a variation of this story. And this is a story that is not only boring, because everyone does the same story, but it's also a story that as a consumer gives me zero value, gives me zero emotion, does not tell me why brand A versus brand B. And, it is for those who listen now and, maybe say, yeah, but however, blah, blah, blah. I tell you, no, there is no but, there is no however in this case. It is just pure wrong. And I do a ton of competitive analysis, because when we work on optimizing the value proposition for our clients, and when we work on these kind of fixing those root causes, the very first thing I always do is a brutally honest brand audit. And in the brand audit, we always look at the storytelling of the brand, of the client that retains us, and then we look at all their key competitors. In some cases, we look at 20 brands, 30 brands, 40 brands, and we always go and say, okay, how does a consumer see the brand? And I can tell you, in 100%, it's not even 90%, it can be in 100% of every competitive analysis that I've been doing in my entire life, in 100% of cases, the majority of brands in the category have the same story. You just change the date when the brand was born, so to speak. But fundamentally, whether this is in aviation, whether this is in airlines, whether this is in hospitality, they all tell you the same story, with few exceptions. But the majority of brands, let's say within every category, 90% of brands, you see them next to each other, you strip the story to the essentials, it's the same story. So if you are brand A, and then your competitor is brand B, and then there's another competitor, brand C, and all of you tell me the same story, as a customer, which shall I buy? And then the answer is very simple. I'm going to buy the cheapest. I'm going to always buy the cheapest of the three with the same story.
Yeah, you wrote something very interesting in your report. I think it's the last sentence of this report. You said, if you cannot make a client dream, you will not make them pay.
100%.
And in luxury in 2026, what does it actually mean to make someone dream?
This is a I like where you're going with the question. This is the hardest question. This is the question that and it's the hardest question, because there is not the one word answer. It is very different. As for example, here on this call, we are three, and and probably every one of us has different aspirations, different things, and so on. For example, I give you an example. I do a lot of exercise because I also have to travel a lot, so I try to stay as fit, as healthy as possible. I'm also very much into everything, longevity and so on. So, for example, for me, what I eat is very important, nutrition is very important, and a continuation of my lifestyle when I travel is very important. So now through, advising so many brands, I travel so often. I would say at least 50, 60% of my time, I'm not in the office, but I'm somewhere, somewhere in the world in a hotel. So for example, for me, therefore, hotels are maybe different than for others. I still want to have a nice room or so, of course, but that's the least thing I care about. And I care about something very simple, for example. I don't drink caffeine, but I love coffee. So I want to have espresso pots in my hotel room that are decaffeinated. And so my travel planner, because I had so many bad experience, my travel planner, every time I go to a hotel, the travel planner makes sure with the management of that property that all the caffeinated capsules are out of the room and there's only decaf capsules so that I also don't make a mistake and have the caffeine instead. I don't drink alcohol. So, for example, in many hotels, you get the bottle of wine. It's irrelevant for me because I'm not going to touch that bottle of wine. So, but I like nice things, and I like, for example, non-alcoholic cocktails also. So, again, now my travel planner has to speak with the hotel and say, okay, if you want to make Daniel happy when he comes, then have a welcome drink, but you have to make it a little bit different. So that's, for example, for me important. And then I want to have a great gym in the hotel, or I want to have maybe a yoga Pilates studio next to the hotel, so that I can basically before meetings or so, after meetings, I can exercise, and then I want to have like a restaurant also there where the food is great. So now look at 95% of hotels in the world, they cannot deliver on that because the rest they focus on the hotel room, but the restaurants often don't have healthy food options or not enough healthy food options. So then this means I have to go now outside of the hotel where often I don't have the time, and so on. It becomes inconvenient. So for example, for me, when you ask what is your dream, for me, the dream in a hotel is actually that the things that I have at home, I want them in the hotel. I want it just to work. I want to check in. It's seamless. I have exactly the same setup in the hotel than I have at home. Then I'm happy. Another traveler, if, for example, when my wife travels, she has completely different things. Maybe for her, the spa is more important. Maybe for her, having some me moments, indulging moments is more important. For her, for example, the view is very important. I couldn't care less about the view because I'm anyway just working or going in and out and using the hotel to sleep. But for her, for example, now when we booked the summer vacation or so, we really made sure the rooms all have rooms to the ocean and so on. So two different people living in the same household have completely different expectations. So now, what does it mean for you as a brand? What does it mean as a brand? First of all, you have to acknowledge that not every customer is different. It's the same. Every customer has different expectations. But we basically offer the same story. Now a hotel maybe, look just at randomly, maybe after the show, for those of you who hear the show or see the show, do the exercise and just randomly go on your computer and look up 10 random hotels. You will see practically the same, and do different brands. You will see practically the same website, same imagery, same things, same story. Yeah. But for example, for me, if a hotel would tell me, we cater exactly to the person who wants a healthy lifestyle, wants to exercise, blah, 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 I'm going to book that hotel. And this means the time for brands to cater to every client it was this in the same way is over. You have to have a point of view. And most brands are afraid to have a point of view because they think if we basically are about this, what about that client? And my point of view is, you will never get 100% market share. No brand today, especially in the luxury industry, has 100% market share. As a consumer, I rather make one choice that is 100% right for me than to do choices that are 50 or 60% right. So I think it's an obligation for brands today to be much sharper in their promise, be much clearer in their promise, and not try to be everything to everyone. And that's, for example, if you look at the automotive industry, and especially the German automotive industry that is right now in decline and in absolute crisis mode. That's one of the things that, in my point of view, happened to them. You have 3 or 4 of the premium brands, and they basically were, I would say, to a certain extent differentiated maybe 30 years ago. There was a clear point of view for brand A versus brand B and versus brand C. They all had a different audience. They all had different model lineups. They all looked different. They all felt different. And then, one brand said, brand B just launched a smaller car. If we don't launch a smaller car, we will be left out. Okay, what does brand A do? Now they also launch a smaller car. Then, I think BMW was the first with the M division, selling these kind of performance cars. And then I think at some point Mercedes-Benz integrated AMG and made basically kind of the answer to M. And then Audi had the S division, and so on. So in the end, what was unique to one brand suddenly becomes more or less the same for every brand. And then as a result, you do this long enough that you emulate what your competitors are doing. And then the brand equities start to blur. And then the customers don't know anymore what does actually brand A stand for, and what is brand B standing for, and what is brand C standing for. And then it becomes, over time, what I like to call the sea of sameness. Everyone does the same thing. Everyone does directionally similar expressions. And the customers basically just see, look, brand A looks the same, B looks the same, C looks the same, D looks the same. What do? They go for the cheaper brand. This is exactly what happened now in China. This is what happens in many places in the world. And this is why suddenly the brands that were used to have 10, 20 years of automatic growth suddenly are all seeing negative numbers, customers running away, and so on. And they don't have really the answers to that.
Yeah.
And the answer in the end, in my point of view, is very simple. It's going back and redefining, recalibrating to what was it that made the brand unique at some point in time. And then basically building on those values, and then basically bringing those values not only to life, but strengthening those values. Those are really the things that are critical now and in the future.
Yeah, it was my last question. I wanted to know, because I also wanted to make this episode useful, because it's very insightful for us. And I know, like, the people who are listening to the show are CMOs, brand founders, and like for the ones who recognize themselves in what you've been describing for the last hour, and maybe in your report. Someone listening to this right now who recognize his brand in everything you have described, what is the first things they should do? Sorry. Is it going back to the roots? Going back to what
I would do three things. And I would say my recommendation is do this whether you believe you're successful or whether you basically are in crisis mode. Of course, if you're in crisis mode, you have to do it much more brutally honest, much faster, and then there's no time to wait. There's a really sense of urgency. But also, if your brand is doing well, I would still recommend those 3 steps. The first step is make a brutally honest brand audit. And I cannot overstate the word brutally honest. I'm often invited to boards, consult with management teams, and I have also the opportunity to read, the internal papers, to listen to them, to see what they have been doing in the past, but also sometimes to witness what they're doing in the now. And I would say the majority the majority of internal assessments, so for example, when I read SWOT analysis from brands or so, is by far too positive. It's very, very hard, and I have also a bit of an empathy with that, because it's very hard to self-criticize. You know, when you look, when you manage a brand, and you want it to be right, you want it to be done right, and you want to believe that what you do is the right thing. So this is why often we overestimate. The other thing is, we sometimes advise brands in the same category. So I basically have the opportunity sometimes to see, several brands that are kind of competing for the same customer. And I can tell you, I've never seen one company that was not convinced that what they do is better than anyone else. Every single company I've been talking to, every single manager or management team believes they are better than everyone else. And that's very human. We would probably not even function if we didn't have that drive and that belief that we are better or could be better than others. But if you do a brand audit, that's deadly. If you go in with that scenario and say, we are better than everyone else, or we have a competitive advantage where you don't have a competitive advantage, then what does it make? It basically gives you an illusion, and you will lose time. And again, this is why sense of urgency right now is the name of the game. So start with a brand audit, do the brand audit as brutally honest as possible. And my experience is that often you can't do this internally. We see that internally companies often struggle with this because there's so much emotion, and then often also we know there's often political things. There is certain things that have been done because, I don't know, the founding family wanted it, or someone important at the company wanted it, and so on. So every company has these kind of, I don't know, holy cows or so that you cannot touch and that are typically untouched. But by basically being too kind to our own projects, by too kind to the things we are doing, we often don't address the things that need to be addressed. So that's the number one thing. The second thing is, assume that your brand story today is not optimal. I would assume that. Again, most that we analyze from the external side, we find significant improvement potential. And if the brand story is not differentiated enough, then the brand story is not going to create value for the customer, period. And there's no hedging. We cannot say it creates a little bit. No, it will create same story than everyone else, same value than anyone else. The one that has the lowest prices will always win in that scenario. So especially in the luxury industry, where you want to charge more, or you want to earn the right to charge more, and you want to really have also a premium offer and want to create the profitability that allows you to create that, then the fundamental brand story is important. So now brand story is not a campaign. This is also a fundamental misunderstanding that I'm seeing again and again. Most people think, we just ask our advertising agency to do that and it's a campaign. No, the brand story is the ultimate foundation of what the company is. Let's call it the fundamental point of view. And so, for example, when we work with our clients, often we prepare the brand story, and then we go together with our client to their advertising agency, brief the agency to bring the brand story to life. The mistake that often is done is that the campaign is thought as the brand story, and that basically then maybe someone who is very good in building campaigns is tasked to do a task that is so fundamentally strategic that they just don't know how to do that. As I would never do an advertising campaign, for example, because I'm not an advertising person myself, but I know how to build the story. So the storytelling is so critical, and the storytelling always has to be defined through the eyes of the customer. So it's not about we are this, we are that, we are the house from blah, blah, blah. But the question, the story should be written in, you can do this differently. So we have to switch perspective and have to think, what is actually our value proposition, our role in the life of the customer? And this also means we have to define what I call the target emotion. And the target emotion is so critical because this is the foundation for the third thing. So you asked for 3 recommendations. The first is to do the audit. The second is to optimize the story. And the third now is you have to make the story tangible. So how do you make a story tangible? Through products. So products have to be an expression of the story. So everything basically becomes, the story becomes like the driver, the fundamental truth, and then everything has to be around that. But then the other thing that so many brands neglect is the customer experience. The customer experience in one place should be different to another place. And I sometimes think that if I give an illustration, it's easier. Think about restaurants. And I think the restaurant industry is really a great one to learn from that. Most restaurants in the world that I've been visiting have exactly the same customer journey. Exactly the same. If you're in the US, what will happen is you go to the restaurant, there will always be a host in front of the restaurant. So you wait until the host shows up because the host is typically not there. Then the host comes, then the host tells you, do you have a reservation? And then I say, of course I have a reservation. Then they look you up in their system. Then they say, oh yeah, I found your reservation. Okay, follow me. Then they bring you to the table. They bring you the menu. Then they ask you if you want to have a water. So then they bring you a couple of waters. Then they come back after a few minutes and ask you which drinks you want. Then they disappear. Then they come back to get your order. They disappear. They bring you your orders. They disappear. Then 2 or 3 times in between, they will refill the glasses. They will take maybe some additional orders. Then they will ask you for the dessert. And then they will bring you the menu and over and out. That's the customer journey that you will get in 95% of restaurants. So I can tell you that with this customer journey, you will create 0 memory. You will create 0 impact to your customer. The food can be as good as it wants to be, but especially if we speak about, the listeners that cater to a luxury audience, if I go to a restaurant, I'm not going to go to a bad restaurant. Every restaurant I'm going to go is going to be a top restaurant, every single one. Mm-hmm. So if you want to stand out, if you want to create a memory, if you want to make me loyal to your place, you have to do something that no one else is doing. You have to do something. The customer journey has to be modified in a way that your customer journey is different to any other customer journey. And this requires knowing who you are first. So very often when we do, for example, projects that are experience optimization projects for our clients, maybe we are retained to optimize the customer experience. I always say, let's take a step back. Let's have a look at your brand story and your brand positioning, because I cannot create an experience that is disconnected to the storytelling of what they want to, who they want to be, how they want to be perceived. And so very often when we start with an experience project, actually we go a step back and work first on fixing the fundamental, the stories. And then once we have the target emotion defined, everyone agrees on the emotion, then we go back and then we basically work on optimizing the experience. And so you can see everything is connected. And the beauty of this is nothing what I said to you today is rocket science. Nothing is basically that fundamentally could not be done. The tricky thing is there is very, very few companies in the world. It's a handful that is able to do that today flawlessly end to end. This is very, very rare. And the reason why it's rare is that often the work is not done at the source. The foundation is not there. So kind of the house is built, but the blueprint is not there. And then everything that is done, coming back also to what you said earlier, isn't it rational to optimize for the quarter? Yeah, then it becomes rational, because if there's no foundation, or if the foundation is very limited, then the only thing you can do is you can try to survive. And then you try to survive the next quarter and the next quarter and the next quarter. You optimize for the survival, you optimize for the next quarter, but you are not basically building the brand foundation. The beauty is when you build the brand foundation in the right way, and then you make executing against that foundation non-negotiable, so that every single decision that is taken going forward is always taken through the lens, is it strengthening the brand foundation we have just built, or is it weakening the brand foundation we have just built? Then suddenly you start to create like an ecosystem of experiences, of products, of kind of customer touch points that then bring that thing to life. And to create that it's hard, but it's possible. The beauty is the rewards are incredible. I would estimate that brands that do that exercise right can increase their profitability 10x within 2 or 3 years. Sometimes maybe more than 10x. And they can also increase their revenue in a quite spectacular way. Every single brand that I managed myself, basically I applied those principles. And I have to admit, in my early days, when I was young, maybe young brand manager and so on, or was responsible for, global product categories myself, I was doing this intuitively. I didn't have, let's say, the framework at that time. I didn't think this through as a full framework. But now I've seen in the last couple of years, I just saw more and more that you do that, you always get the results. And the beauty is that, most of the competitors will not do that, or will not do that in the right fashion. So to me, the real competitive advantage today is not anymore the product. The product, any great product can be copied. Any, any clever claim on your website you do can be copied and will be copied, for sure. That is normal. The better you are, the more you're going to be copied. What you cannot copy, or what is very hard to copy, is the entire ecosystem that you build around one fundamental idea and then flawless execution of that idea. And that is what I would recommend. And I think I also put in the end of the report, I think I put one sentence that said, in a sense, get in touch if you really want to do that work. And I would say, and this, I did this deliberately because it takes a commitment to, this is not an easy fix. You cannot fix a brand quick and dirty and then expect that you're going to have results tomorrow. This is why, I spoke about Burberry. This is why Burberry over the last 20 years has tried and tried and tried and tried and tried. And then again, as I said, every couple of years, the next one comes in, tries again. And then you look at the long-term results and they go like this and this and this and this, and they just go down. Then they go a little bit up and then they go down again. But the long-term is a downward trajectory. And this is simply that seemingly so far, the different management teams, the new one still to be seen. There's some hope that the new management team hopefully does a few things better. But in the past, if you look at the people who were running that brand before, practically everyone did the same thing. Short-term fixation, trying to fix things without fixing the fundamentals. Maybe they were under so much pressure or so to deliver that they didn't take the real time. So I want to be very clear, it's not easy. But if a brand does not do the hard work, then I can guarantee that the results are going to be catastrophic. And, coming back to how we started, with the report and with the findings of the report, we have the perfect storm, so to speak. Customers are changing, new generation of customers. Also, choices, we have not spoken about this, but choices are changing because now AI is also helping consumers to make decisions. If I make a significant, this morning, when I was walking my dog, what did I do on my phone? I went to Claude and asked Claude, because I want to exchange my door lock, and I asked Claude, should I buy the new generation of the door lock that I already have? So, we are not actually even doing these decisions ourselves anymore. We are actually asking now our AI helpers to give us those decisions. And so as brands, we have to really understand that times have changed. And desire is not only anymore, in this blah, 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 yeah, we are better, and in this kind of statements that consumers can easily validate and check. The ultimate judge is the consumer. If the consumer dreams, you won. If the consumer is bored, you lost. It's very simple. If the customer is inspired, you won. If the customer is neutral, you lost. And so I would say that the question that every business manager, every leader should ask themselves is the customer really at the center of attention, or if the customer just a collateral, so to speak? And it's a hard question. And I would argue, I'm a customer, you are customers. Everyone on this call is a customer. Just ask yourself, how many interactions do you have on a daily base? Hotels, when you're in an airline, when you are in a restaurant, when you go to a store. How many interactions do you have that are mind-blowing? How many interactions do you have that you walk out of a place and you say, wow, this is an experience that was so amazing that I want to come back to? I would estimate the answer is it's not that many. It's the absolute exception. And I think should be always something we should take serious, because if this is what we feel, there could be a high chance that our customers actually feel the same, from the brands that we manage. And so be really, really self-critical with what your organization is doing, because it's the only way you can win long term.
Build a great foundation and make someone dream. That's the whole thing. And
Absolutely.
maybe like if you can answer that honestly about your brand, you know exactly where you stand. Daniel Langer's report, The Cost of Waiting, is available at equitebrands.com. Go read it. And if this episode resonated with you, please take 30 seconds to rate and review the podcast. It sounds like a small thing, but it's not. It's genuinely the best way to help us grow and bring more conversation like this one to more people, and share it. Send it to one person in your world who needs to hear this today. We have one more episode before the summer break, and it's going to be a great one as well. Stay close. Daniel, thank you very, very much for this insightful episode. I really loved it.
Super. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. And anytime again. Thank you.
Thank you. See you very soon. Thank you very much.
Super. Speak soon. Bye-bye.
I loved it.
Super.
Yeah, I